Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Labor and Sex Trafficking State Update. All lines have been placed on listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for questions and comments following the presentation. If you should require assistance throughout the conference, please press *0 on your telephone keypad to reach a live operator. And at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Megan McCann. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to NCSL's Labor and Sex Trafficking State Update webinar. We're thrilled that you're able to join us today. We'll hear from some excellent experts in addition to a state legislator later on, and we'll kind of start the presentation with a look at NCSL. So here at NCSL, we are a bipartisan legislative research organization. We serve legislators and legislative staff in all 50 states who are members of our organization by virtue of being elected. We sort of three different categories that we work in. One is improving the quality and effectiveness of the institution of state legislatures. One is promoting policy innovation and communication among state legislatures. And then one is providing state legislatures a strong, cohesive voice at the federal level. So just a little bit about NCSL, and now we'll talk a little bit about the human trafficking project that we have here.
Hi, my name is Rich Williams. I work with Megan on our human trafficking here at NCSL Human Trafficking Project. And so to give you a little bit of information, this webinar is brought to you as part of our partnership with the Federal Office for Victims of Crime. And we have a few other resources that I'm going to show you where you can find them now on our website, also under this project. And so here's my attempt to use technology. And so we're going to start by showing you a meeting that we held last year's Legislative Summit in August of 2016. Let's scroll all the way over to the side. There we go. And so if you wanted to listen to an audio summary of that meeting or see the agenda from that meeting, you would go to this page, and you can find our Go IDs in the bottom right-hand corner, which is not right there, 30885 for this one. The roster, and again, if you wanted to listen to this, it's about a 13-minute presentation on, this was specific to safe harbor laws and anti-child trafficking efforts taken in the states. And then I'll give it to Megan to give a description of the main piece, which is our human trafficking overview webpage.
Yes, this is kind of the one-stop shop for all of our trafficking project resources. It details federal efforts, and then scrolling down, you can get into some of the state efforts, which goes to our sort of tab page that gets into criminalization, survivor protections in court, services and funding for survivors, administration and coordination, and business regulations. So each of these topics is linked in this next page.
So yeah, and just this is basically our attempt to give an overview of the different policy options that come up in state laws. And a good place to start is on the criminal penalties tab. It sort of shows you what each state defines, or the options for defining trafficking, and what the criminal penalties are. In each of these sections, we give some broad examples, but if you would like more in-depth information for any particular subject that's on here, you can feel free to get in touch with Megan or I, and we'd be happy to answer your questions and provide more detailed information. And just to show you what else is on the other tabs, we have the Judicial Protections tab, which is basically state efforts to support survivors either through deflection or diversion from the criminal justice process, or through legal measures or financial protections subsequent to their interaction with their traffickers. Did you want to say?
Yes. On our funds and services page, and if you're having a hard time seeing it, there's a little in the top corner that can make the page go full screen, so you might be able to see a little more of the page if you're having some issues. So in our funds and services tab, looks at a myriad of services that human trafficking survivors may need, from basic to complex legal services, housing, healthcare, and basic needs such as clothing and food. It also looks at state legislation that provides for those services and state special funds that have been created through legislation to provide services to trafficking survivors. And in the Administration and Cooperation tab, it looks at coordination of efforts between many different state agencies to combat human trafficking in the states, including legislatively and executive-created task forces. And it also takes a look at the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act and the provisions related to child sex trafficking.
And then the last one, the Awareness and Regulation tab, takes a look at what states are doing to promote the awareness that human trafficking is happening, and then also how they are getting involved with the business community to further and better fight trafficking. One of the areas that we get a ton of questions on and is featured here is the posting and requirement of the National Human Trafficking Hotline information. And again, if you'd like more detail on those statutes, feel free to reach out to us and we can give you a table with 50 state information on that issue. And then just to show you the last resource currently that we're featuring today, this is our Human Trafficking Enactments database, which starts with enactments in 2015, and you can search it by the topics, which are defined up here a little bit higher. And then also you can pick by state and then search them a keyword as well. And so I've started already tracking information for 27. Those bills haven't been included yet. There's about 17 of them. And some of the early things I've seen have just been more stuff on awareness and recognition of Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And then also a few changing definitions of child abuse to include definitions regarding human trafficking.
All right, and if you did go full screen and are hoping to get back to the webinar screen, just go ahead and hit your escape button on your keyboard and you'll be brought back to the webinar screen. So I think the next slide sort of talks about, and we'll provide a quick definition before we get into our excellent presenters here today, is what is human trafficking and what do we mean when we refer to human trafficking. So in terms of our project and this work in this webinar, human trafficking means both sex and labor trafficking. So under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that you can see here, it defines, I won't read them for you, but there's definitions for both sex and labor trafficking, and so we'll give you a little bit more detail into both of those here when we present. I will note that you can download this presentation by going to at the top there's a bar on the right side, and the third from the left on those icons will give you a media library, and you will be able to download the PowerPoint presentation there. And the webinar will be archived in 1 week. So we'll go to www.ncsl.org/webinars to access all of those. And you can ask questions at any time in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. So we will go introduce our presenters next.
And this is so the people that you've actually come to listen to today, and we do have and we're very grateful for them for their time and participation. Leading off, we're going to have Kirsta Melton. She's with the Texas Attorney General's office, and she's going to be followed by Pat Medage, who's a senior attorney at the Colorado Legal Services. And then to respond and then to provide an overview of what he's doing legislatively on human trafficking issues, we're going to have Colorado State Representative Paul Lundeen. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kirsta.
Good afternoon. This is Kirsta Melton from the AG's office in Texas. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Okay, good. All right, that was my biggest concern. All right, what I want to do today is really talk a little bit about what the AG's office in Texas has done on the issue of human trafficking, share a little bit about our particular program and some of the benefits of the approach that we have been taking, and then also share with you some thoughts or ideas as legislators or legislative staff about the impact of the things that you are doing on the legislative side for both practitioners as well as victims. So I think the best way to do that would be to start out by sharing kind of how we exist. We have a really big title, Human Trafficking and Transnational Organized Crime section. Our AG's office has been involved in human trafficking since approximately 2007 with the creation of a statewide human trafficking prevention task force that had kind of begun as a policy arm to begin to try to coordinate what the state's agenda should be legislatively for human trafficking. As you all know, trafficking impacts such a wide variety of groups of people, whether that's 501c3 direct services providers, whether that's your victim and survivor populations, whether you've got the agencies or the law enforcement, any of those individuals that in some way participate in the system. And so they all have different perspectives coming to the table, and they all need representation because, as we all know, when it comes to trafficking, you cannot attack this through a single agency or one group acting on its own. So the statewide task force eventually led to the AG's office having a designated human trafficking prosecutor and single investigator. But at the end of 2015, our office decided it wanted to make a much more substantive commitment to the issue of human trafficking, and so it created our section, which includes 4 prosecutors, 4 investigators, a victim advocate, a criminal analyst, and a special projects manager. And the reason for such a broad set of staff was largely because we don't think that the issue can be tackled solely through investigation and prosecution. We think that you really need a very holistic approach when it comes to looking at the issue of human trafficking. And so our office engages in investigation and prosecution around the state of Texas across all aspects of trafficking. So that's going to be cases where you have adults and children as victims. It's going to be cases that involve international and domestic, both victims and defendants. And it's also going to involve both aspects of trafficking, sex and labor. You will find across the states that it's often easier for people to gather support for sex trafficking, and particularly sex trafficking of children, because it's something that is very intrinsic for us as human beings to be appalled at things that are happening to our children and to our most vulnerable populations. However, what we find in trafficking is that often many of our victims are people who are in incredibly vulnerable populations, but not populations that are either politically favorable or that are people that other people are quick to care about. So think about people who've been engaged in prostitution, for instance, already on the streets for 10 years and are drug addicts. Think about individuals who may have come to this country illegally, only to be exploited by an employer who manages to keep them in check by continuing to exploit that illegal status. Think about individuals who have a criminal history or a mental health background or multiple placements in the system. Think about children who come from homes where they are already abused or neglected, runaways, throwaways, and have gone through the system. Those are the type of people who are very often victims of human trafficking but don't have the same sort of political or legislative support when we're looking at giving out of funds or funding programs. They aren't as pretty, frankly, as this idea of an innocent child being exploited. So our office, in recognizing that, wanted us to have a very holistic approach to the issue. And so we do that. When you take a look at what our team is involved in, it's a very wide spectrum of conduct. We do have investigation, and our investigators have statewide jurisdiction. There's obviously only 4 of them, so they are not involved in every human trafficking investigation around the state, but they do have the ability to engage in specific operations, to assist other law enforcement, and they do generate independent case investigations that can then be handled either by local prosecutors or by us. As prosecutors, we come from a state where the AG does not have what's called concurrent jurisdiction. We cannot simply walk in to a jurisdiction and take any case that we would like and take it to trial. Instead, we are asked in by our duly elected district and county attorneys. So we are really, in a lot of ways, a support to local prosecutors. They will say, hey, we are recusing ourselves from this case. Can you step in? They may say, you know what? We've never dealt with a human trafficking case before. We'd like your expertise. Will you come in and try it with us? They may say, you know what? We don't have the time or the expertise to deal with this. We're going to hand it over to you. But in that way, we come along as a support to those, and we can actually try cases all the way across the state. One of the major aspects of our section, and one of the things that our particular AG has been very dedicated to, is the issue of training. Those of you who are familiar with human trafficking recognize there are many things about trafficking that go contrary to the way that things have always been done. When you think about police officers, for instance, policing is generally a reactive business. Someone is harmed, there is a crime, a call is made, the police receive that call, and then they respond. Unfortunately, in the world of both sex and labor trafficking, you don't have victims calling in to say that they've been harmed. You have victims who are often incredibly afraid of the system, have been burned by the system, feel disregarded by the system, or are perhaps fugitives from the system in some way, shape, or form. So the incentives are actually perverse. They have no reason to call in, despite the fact that they're being victimized. So because of that, law enforcement, first responders, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, family law lawyers, probation officers, and members of the general public all need training. They need training so that their perspective allows for them to identify a victim effectively, to see someone and not necessarily say, hey, that's a defendant, but instead, that could be a victim. I need to ask additional questions here and determine if this person whom I'm inclined to arrest for prostitution might indeed be a victim of human trafficking. Or I need to ask questions to determine whether these workers that I've encountered in this situation may be being exploited, may be being trafficked by their employer. And I'm going to have to get past their fear of the system to help bring a perpetrator to justice. So we trained last year in person, the 3 attorneys in this office, 7,900 people across the state of Texas in 106 trainings. And we continue to pursue that training agenda in every way possible. We also help with the statewide task force in establishing a coordinated legislative agenda for trafficking in the state of Texas. There is a statewide task force bill that goes forward in each legislative session that has been worked through more than 50 different state agencies, 501c3s, law enforcement, district attorney's office, direct victim services organizations to kind of winnow out key provisions in the law that need to be fixed, things that need to be added, and then those recommendations go forward. We are participants in all of the regional coalitions statewide that are fighting human trafficking. We believe being in fellowship with and in coordination with other anti-human trafficking folks across our state is critical, as well as providing them a voice into state government. We can help leverage whatever sort of resources we have on their behalf. Our special projects this year include a conference for prosecutors. This is a brass tacks, how do you try these kind of cases? Prosecutor-only conference that we're putting on in November, and then we're in the midst of creating a documentary training film that will be available digitally for all state employees, contractors, and the general public in the state of Texas. And finally, we spend a substantial period of time mentoring others because we believe that that is a key component of developing the anti-trafficking community of the future. So that's kind of what we've been doing. What are the practical implications of what we do for legislation, but also what are the practical implications or suggestions maybe perhaps that from my perspective as a practitioner that I would have for legislation going forward. And these are general because each state has its own situation. But the first one is that each state does need to craft their own solutions. Not all things that are listed as national trends or stated by national groups are worth following or are applicable to your state. You've got to know the issue as it exhibits itself in your state. I would tell you as a prosecutor, it's important for the legislature sometimes to take a breath because we all want so desperately to do something about this issue. And your role as legislators is to legislate. Sometimes, though, we've got to take a breath and wait to see how the statutes that we've already implemented will be interpreted by the courts. And that way we know how to modify them, whether they're working, what good they're doing, or what damage they're doing. In that same vein, you want to talk about the practicalities of the law with the people who will be most affected or will be expected to use it. Sometimes ideas are super, but in practice, someone who would have to use that law, perhaps in court, might say, you know what, I would never choose to use that statute because of the way it's constructed. I would use a different statute because it's much simpler, for instance, as a prosecutor to prove it. It's just one example. And finally, the last thought I have, because I believe my time ends at 12:22, is do you have a long-term strategic and financial plan for serving victims? This is probably the area that the country is most lacking in. We know we have a victim population. We know that they have incredible long-term rehabilitative needs, and we know there's a shortage of funds to be allocated to that. And so we've got to use the funds that we have. One, we've got to make it a priority. Two, we've got to use those funds strategically and well. Can multiple states join together to create regional programs or facilities? What are we doing in individual communities to use the resources that we already have on the ground? What are we doing to kind of step outside the boxes that we all live in to reach across the aisle to one another and to work with people that we haven't worked with before? So those are my thoughts, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Kirsta. There's a few things I'd like to just point out. The first is if you do have questions for the end of the webinar, you can type them into the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And then I'd also like to point out with some of the things that Kirsta mentioned, if you're interested, we do have some 50-state information on the both public and private employees and officials who are required to currently receive human trafficking training under state statute. Also on the types of multidisciplinary coordinating entities that Kirsta mentioned were sort of the genesis of her unit. And then also we do have a good deal of information on Minnesota's program that ties together public entities and community-based services in order to provide services to survivors and what that's cost them. They've put probably, I think, from what I've seen, some of the broadest financial efforts towards their current plan. It's referred to as the No Wrong Door model, and just last year they expanded those service options from just youth up through age 24. So those are just some of the resources that you can find from us if you just ask. Megan or I would be happy to provide that. So again, thank you, Kirsta. And now we'd like to hear from Pat Medich from the Colorado Legal Services. Pat?
Yes, hello everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just look, and do I already have controls? Let me just check, it looks like it. So yeah, I appreciate being here. I am the type of presenter who likes to see the faces of those people I'm speaking to, so webinars are always a little bit uncomfortable for me, so bear with me. I am with Colorado Legal Services, so I'm not with law enforcement. I'm not a prosecutor. I've been involved in a number of cases that were prosecuted or investigated, so my perspective comes from that. I am with a statewide legal aid organization, so we're a nonprofit and provide free legal services statewide to indigent individuals. And we have had a human trafficking project since 2006. I worked on our first case in 2004. So I'm more not talking about programs as much as about sort of labor trafficking scenarios and challenges in investigating or prosecuting labor cases. So I start with this slide of just sort of an ordinary subdivision just to flag that, in my opinion, domestic servitude cases are very prevalent and very often overlooked just because there's so much control over the individual and so they're just so hidden. I'm not going to review a scenario actually, but I just like to flag that at the start of the presentation. So our first scenario is a case that was a restaurant case in Boulder, Colorado. I guess there are people from all over the country here, but probably most of you know the reputation of Boulder as very liberal. It's, people, the nickname is the People's Republic of Boulder. It's, perceived as very humanitarian, or they consider themselves that way anyway. And there was a restaurant that was quite popular. Well, it was a group of restaurants that were quite popular. And in fact, the owner was trafficking the restaurant workers. They came here lawfully on visas. The restaurant owner, who's the defendant here, was here on an investor visa. That's a special visa for people who can invest a certain amount of money in this country, and they were investor employees. So he tricked them about the terms of their visas, about the work that they were going to be doing. They thought they were going to be chefs, and they were just ordinary prep cooks and dishwashers and so forth. Immediately imposed various debts on them, including visa renewal fees and just various bogus rent charges and other debts. There was a failure to pay overtime, so they received straight time for their work, and as I said, that pay was not always received because of the various debts he imposed on them. There were unpaid payroll taxes, a lot of monitoring, because he not only monitored them in the restaurant, but they lived in housing that he provided, so they were sort of constantly monitored. There are a couple of interesting aspects about this case. One is an American young man started working at the restaurant. He had been in Thailand and spoke Thai, so he wanted to use his Thai and work at this restaurant. And so he earned the trust of the workers to begin to learn what was happening, because it looked completely ordinary. It just looked like an ordinary, popular, busy restaurant. So the workers first trusted him. So it's back to Kirsta's point. They didn't go call the police and say, we're being abused here. They had to encounter somebody they could trust and start to confide in him. He went to a local organization called the Boulder Human Rights Commission. That's, I guess, a city government entity that first, I guess, contacted various federal law enforcement agencies. My understanding is from different meetings attended by law enforcement is that the FBI first brought the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office as a forced labor case, and it was declined. And later, ICE brought it under what I call paper crimes, like the tax issues, the failure to pay payroll taxes, and some wire fraud type issues. There was a plea. Sinprasong was convicted. The U.S. Attorney's Office, through Department of Justice, pursued remission, so that forfeited assets did make their way back to the workers as restitution, which was very impressive and somewhat rare. And the workers did obtain T visas as victims of trafficking, and most or all ultimately became permanent residents. So it was a pretty good outcome, although the ultimate sentence was just a year in prison, because that was, for immigration purposes, that was sort of the point at which that becomes significant for immigration purposes, because it would result in Sinprasong's deportation and prevent him from coming back in the future, because he'd be in this category called aggravated felon. So the sentence was not particularly long. That was actually some concern to the workers, because he was going back to Thailand where their families were, so they were not entirely comfortable with the deportation, but that was what was pursued, and due to his cooperation in forfeiture proceedings and so forth, the judge accepted a plea agreement with the one-year sentence. So I think it's an important case to flag, again, that there can be an ordinary situation that seems ordinary, but there is this coercion going on, and that there may be multiple entities involved. And so back to Kirsta's point that there need to be collaborations, there needs to be communications across, not only, across different, not between nonprofits and law enforcement, between different levels of law enforcement from federal to state to local that really help bring these cases forward. So traffickers, take advantage of people's vulnerabilities and control others. So the issue, what we try to focus is on this control of others, whether they're controlling them for the purposes of commercial sex acts or restaurant work or construction work. The ultimate issue is control. This particular slide touches on both control of foreign nationals and U.S. citizens. So obviously threats of deportation apply to foreign nationals, but a youth who has left an abusive home, the scenario Kirsta mentioned earlier, threat of returning that youth to the abusive home could keep them in place. Threats to family members, maybe controlling them with drugs or alcohol, which can also result in a debt that they cannot escape from. And keep them dependent on the trafficker to provide the substance. Holding of documents, whether it's for a citizen or a foreign national, but especially a foreign national holding onto a passport or a visa and so forth. There's definitely an exaggerated sense of the power often that the victim will have. This exaggerated sense of the trafficker's power, that they know the police or they know immigration and can retaliate very effectively. So red flags, in doing community education to the public, we really try to caution that they shouldn't think about rescuing. And maybe no first glance is determinative, but certainly we all are in a position to see red flags. So with obviously workers or other individuals who are not free to come and go, who don't have their documents for whatever reason. Literally there can be housing that's so secured that the windows are blocked and there's the windows have bars and so forth. Certainly not always, and often the control doesn't require that. There's so much psychological control. You don't need locks or bars over the windows, but that can be a red flag. Working long hours, working to pay off a debt, anxiety or unwilling to interact. Again, that could be a worker could be anxious because of immigration status or because it's a youth who's not trusting the system. So we can't assume all of these mean trafficking, but again, they're red flags. Obviously, under 18, there's no requirement to show force, fraud, or coercion under the federal law to show sex trafficking, so any minor providing commercial sex acts. And a controlling boss, what's not in here is somebody who's not getting medical care, or if they get medical care, there's somebody who's always with them when they go to the doctor, or if they have any other interaction with the public, somebody's always with them or sort of controlling them. So there are plenty of others, but I will leave it at that. There are different rights. Obviously, you all know about prosecution, and ideally restitution goes along with that. Protection orders. There's a civil right to sue, so we have brought a number of suits. There's various social service support, especially through some federal funders, but some states have pretty good systems in places as well. Visas, that our office does a number of the visas, typically T visas for trafficking, but also sometimes U visas are more appropriate. Those are broader and cover a number of crimes. Sometimes there's what we call servile marriage situation where the spouse is actually requiring the other spouse to work. We have a case recently where the wife literally ran the husband's pizzeria without compensation and with a lot of physical violence. She pursued a domestic violence-based immigration petition, which was more beneficial for various reasons. Depending on what laws you're looking at, obviously you're all with state legislatures, so there are state laws, and then we talked about the federal law earlier. So some misconceptions about trafficking is it's more than smuggling. Smuggling is a violation of the U.S. immigration laws. It's an agreement to cross the borders without permission. It does not become trafficking until there's some sort of level of control imposed on the person, and subsequently they're not free to leave. Similarly, there's a lot of labor exploitation that's not trafficking. It's still maybe unlawful, wage theft or sexual harassment. And there may be remedies, but we get a lot of reports of different, especially wage theft, that people consider trafficking, and it's not trafficking until in some way they're not free to leave or they're being controlled and kept at the location. And except for minors with adults, not all sex work is trafficking. It's when with adults, it's when there's the force, fraud, or coercion. And the last point, with force or violence is not required. I think, and I hope to talk more about that with challenges, but force and violence is not required. It's, I'm sure, much easier to prosecute, but psychological coercion is an important part of the federal law and the Colorado law and probably lots of other state laws. So identifying what that coercion is very important, and it can be more subtle. It's not as obvious as somebody who's locked in a basement or whatever. Let me do a time check. Should I just jump to challenges and maybe skip the second scenario?
You could go through the second scenario.
Okay. So this is a case that did not result in any prosecution. It was a construction case that resulted in a positive civil suit by our office. It resulted in a 10th Circuit case that found trafficking victims were entitled to punitive damages. This federal statute doesn't specify punitive damages, so it was a clarification that punitive damages are available. They ultimately got a large judgment. So this is actually a tax-subsidized senior housing facility in Colorado Springs. Some workers were recruited from Omaha to work for basically a second-tier subcontractor who was doing the framing of this. So it got into the issue of having a general contractor and then a subcontractor, and then the second-tier subcontractor doing the framing work. So the way the workers were controlled is they were actually from Central American country, indigenous. So Spanish was not their first language. I don't know why that's not on the slide actually, but they had this limitation of even reaching out in Spanish was difficult for them, much less in English. They were underfed, literally had like an egg and a packet of ramen noodles every day for food, didn't have adequate water for this very physical framing work. So they were just literally weakened by lack of food. They were strung along. There wasn't physical violence, but they were strung along with promises of pay and a lot of verbal degradation. And at the isolation I mentioned earlier, Colorado Springs, where the part of Colorado Springs they were at was pretty isolated, and there were not a lot of Latinos, and certainly not Latinos who spoke their indigenous language. There were dangerous conditions at the work site, so when there was a workplace accident, they were just scolded and degraded, not protected. Didn't have enough money to get out. They lived in an apartment with that subcontractor, so they were constantly monitored. And the bosses, were much more comfortable with the system and spoke English and Spanish and had relatively more power. Finally, they just sort of had this pride to stick it out and provide for their families because they came here to be the breadwinners. There was an expectation both that others had for them, but they also had this expectation for themselves to provide for their families. And the only way they saw they thought they could do it was sort of hanging on. Until they ultimately decided to escape. So again, no one factor necessarily is determinative, but combined, they were able to obtain a judgment in federal court for damages under the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. So a federal prosecutor, actually the head of the federal Trafficking Prosecution Unit at DOJ, she really highlights that it's the totality of the circumstances. So as was said earlier, I guess Kirsta said this as well, that law enforcement might be accustomed to sort of being reactive and immediately seeing how someone was harmed, and this is an example of how it might take a while to understand the scenario, and it's not, you can't sort of determine in a snap judgment that it's been trafficking. So there are different barriers to overcome. I think Kirsta kind of covered this already. I will flag that they pretty much understand that they've been exploited, but they may not understand it's a crime what's been done to them. They may not understand. A lot of people think trafficking is smuggling, and just don't think of it as crime. Just maybe even blame themselves for getting into a bad situation. May just want to move on. Avoid making waves and just not deal with it. So that those are on the sort of personal level, and fear of intimidation, fear for their family, fear for themselves. So those are sort of the interpersonal challenges, or on a personal level, why investigating a case may be difficult. But systemically, I'll start with a quote and then discuss a little bit more what I sort of hear here. But this was a report by the Urban Institute that they did in 2014 on labor trafficking, and there's a link to it at the end. And they did anonymous interviews with law enforcement, with survivors, and with service providers. And this, to me, kind of sums up the challenge of investigating a labor case. If you have an obvious sex act, many times a day, it's a much clearer violation than sort of piecing together these factors that lead to a conclusion of coercion of the workers. So a little bit more on that. I don't have bullet points on this, because there's a lot. But what I've heard, I serve on the state gubernatorial council, and there are various levels of law enforcement and prosecutors there. So I've heard comments like, I don't know about employment law. Someone might have done a lot of vice work and might be more comfortable investigating, a commercial sex situation where there's coercion. And I've heard, I don't know anything about employment laws, or I don't know anything about immigration law, because there might be a worker on a certain visa. And I guess I would just highlight that those are certainly factors, and factors in the control, that maybe someone's immigration status is being held over them. They're on a certain visa, and like an H-2A or an H-2B, and under that visa they cannot leave the employer without being out of status. Or employment laws, just playing with the books so that it's not clear from the books that the worker's not being paid. The books look okay. It looks as though the workers are being paid. So those are factors, but the ultimate issue is the control being imposed on the person, whether it's a commercial sex situation involving adults or a labor situation. The ultimate issue is the control, not the niceties of immigration law or employment law. And there's help out there, and I know we've talked with our AG's office here about just spreading the word, or just informing local law enforcement of how they can use, especially the federal authorities who have knowledge of the different visas, or obviously wage and hour division and so forth. Another issue that we've heard as far as a challenge is that when it comes to the forced fraud or coercion, or especially a smaller trafficking forced labor case, that it's a he said, she said situation. And it certainly can be, and especially with domestic servitude, it can be, there's not a lot of corroboration. But I guess I would just flag that in the domestic violence context, prosecutors have overcome this, and they bring domestic violence cases, I think, quite regularly that do not have a lot of corroboration, and learn either how to explain why a domestic violence victim stays in a situation, or what factors are controlling them, or using experts. There are more and more experts available for trafficking cases to explain that, okay, there wasn't physical violence, but here's why the coercion occurred. So I think that aspect of it, being a he said, she said situation, can be overcome as well. And finally, I think I've implied it, if not said it directly, with the domestic minor sex trafficking cases, obviously you don't have that sort of extra burden of showing the force, fraud, or coercion. You just need to show that they have been induced into participating in these acts. So that makes that is more of a challenge, and especially if there's the psychological coercion, it can be more just a different posture to sort of take those on, but there are plenty of prosecutors who have done it, and law enforcement agencies that have successfully investigated them, so it can be done. I'm sure there's lots of room for discussion, but I will keep this moving. And here are some resources. The first is an e-guide. It's for task forces, but there's a lot of really useful information in there from the agency that has funded both us and CSL. And then just the second one is that labor trafficking study I mentioned, and then two other resources with different information on their websites. So, okay, so I'm looking at questions, and this is not one for me. I think I'll stop here due to time. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. So just a few things to follow up in some of the stuff that areas that Pat mentioned where we have some 50-state information in case you're interested. We have 50-state information on where survivors can have civil standing to pursue suits against their traffickers, restitution statutes, as well as the differences between the prosecutions for when the survivors are minors or adults, and even 50-state information exploring some of the state differences and what the elements of force, fraud, and coercion are, what counts as that, and then what actions as part of that constitute trafficking crime. So if you're interested in those sorts of things, feel free again to contact either Megan or I, and we'd be happy to provide that for you. In the meantime, unfortunately, Representative Lundeen has been unable to call any of the committee hearing that has run long. It's that pesky public service aspect of legislative careers. But so with that, I think we're going to look, and so far we have one question up there for Kirsta. And would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on the mentoring program that you were talking about in Texas?
Sure, and what we do is really, it's very personal. I often am approached by people who want to go into the field of anti-trafficking. And that may be a student at the high school level, someone at the college level, someone at the law school level, or any other type of graduate program. And people really are curious, what is it I can do to work in this area? Do I want to work in this area full time? How would that look? Do I need to be a prosecutor? Do I need to be, what role can I take? And so we will spend often several hours with an individual just kind of parsing through where they're coming from, what their goals are, what areas, when they have served in the past, whether related to trafficking or other things, have made them most, happy is kind of a silly word, but most satisfied, most fulfilled in their service. And then we try to talk about all the different aspects that you can be involved in. We talk both about the full-time options where you're working in this field as a profession, but also how you could work in this field in your own profession, whether that profession is as a doctor, whether that profession is as a teacher, or any other type of profession. And so we really try to give folks a very broad sense of the movement and what people are doing in the movement, so that they can find their place in it. Because one of the big issues that we've been trying to tackle in the state of Texas is, how do we mobilize our population? How do we mobilize the entire state of Texas? They're not all going to become anti-trafficking experts, nor should they. They each have a role to play, however, in their own community. So how do we equip people to play that role? How do we give them that fundamental knowledge? How do we give them the filter that they're going to need to apply to their children's friends, to the people that are working in their dry cleaning shop, to the kid that's sitting on the corner at 10 o'clock when they pull into the local corner store to get gas? How do they know how to see people and how to interpret what they're seeing? So part of that is this mentoring program that we do, and a lot of it's very informal. I mean, the AG's office has an intern program, and we certainly bring in interns, so student interns during the summer. and that's probably the most formal way in which we do that. But two, we make ourselves available because there are so many people who want to ask these questions and really talk through them, and really don't have anywhere to go because they don't know somebody personally who's working in this area. So we do that. Unrelated to that, but another area that our team works with regularly is researchers all across the country. Obviously, we have close relationships with several research institutions here in Texas that are working on this issue, but we have done interviews with the Urban Institute. We've done interviews with Boston University and the research they're doing. We've done interviews with multiple organizations that are seeking to understand how does the system work, and then what are the points in the system that can be made to better serve both the practitioners as well as to better serve the victims and to make going through, for instance, the legal process less traumatic, but still help us all achieve the societal goals of justice for that victim and justice for the perpetrator.
Thank you. And then, so we were noticing that both of you mentioned over time working with law enforcement, and sort of that people, I think, talk about training people to recognize what human is. Police generally tend to be the first group that's up. I was wondering if you could both talk about how you've seen attitudes there shift and what you think is behind shifting attitudes of how they address trafficking cases.
Pat, do you want to go first, or would you like me to do?
Sure. Yeah, there have been shifting attitudes. I think a point Krista made earlier is important, that I think there is more likelihood of seeing someone as a potential victim than maybe in the past. One example here is forced or coerced drug activity, especially with some Central American youths. So a law enforcement flagged a particular case where that's still under investigation, but where it appeared to be coerced and not just voluntary. And I think here what we've been focusing on in this state is taking the trainings from a level of awareness to a level of next steps. What do you do in a when you see a particular scenario? And because awareness doesn't really overcome the concerns I mentioned earlier, like, well, I don't know anything about immigration law. I don't know anything about employment law. So taking it to the next level in terms of what do you do next, or who can you bring in to help with this, I think is important, and maybe that's already happening more in Texas. So I'll turn it over to you, Krista.
Yeah, we definitely try to target our trainings to our audience. I have been in plenty of trainings where they are general. It's just a re-going over of basic information or concepts. Those are trainings that are not helpful or useful to me as a professional in my professional capacity. So our goal when we're talking to police or law enforcement is to, one, everything we do is case-based work. So we're sharing with them actual cases that are being discovered and prosecuted in the state of Texas. And then we're sharing specific lessons drawn from those cases. And then beyond that, so if I have an hour, we're going to be limited to that. If I'm doing my 8-hour course, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to use the internet in your investigations on these cases. We're going to bring in someone who is a victim advocate to talk about what survivors might be experiencing when they encounter police, how they may behave in certain ways, how the police should view that behavior, and how they should deal with it or find a way to help that victim be in a much more comfortable position in that. We would also bring in typically a successful law enforcement agent who has worked in this area to go through a case scenario of their own. So what I have found in terms of shifting as attitudes is when police understand that they have encountered a victim or that they may have missed victims, their attitudes begin to change because they recognize, oh, whoa. And particularly, again, it goes back to that kid versus adult issue. We all have a soft spot in our heart for kids. You don't become a police officer because you want to make $1 million. You become a police officer because you want to bust bad guys and put them in jail and save people. And so you want to appeal to that, and when they get a sense of that, when they realize, whoa, this is happening, I've either seen this and didn't recognize it, or here's my opportunity to actually make a difference in a life, then their hearts, of all but the hardest, are going to change. And they're going to begin to recognize, okay, this is a big deal. I've had the same thing happen in audiences with teachers, where teachers will come up and say, oh my gosh, as I'm listening to the stories, I've realized that over the past 10 years, I've probably seen a solid handful of these kids and didn't recognize what I was seeing, didn't know didn't know that I should be reporting it, didn't know what it meant when I saw these red flags. And now I only wish that I had known what I know now. So that's the reaction you want from your training. You want people to say, if only I had known then, because they're already applying your knowledge. They're already applying to life scenarios what they've just heard. And so you then hope that going forward they can take that knowledge and apply it in an effective way.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll wrap it up. We have one more question that came in. I just want to point out to everyone that our contact information is on the screen. If you have any questions about this webinar, about our project on human trafficking, or about how you're addressing human trafficking in your state, don't hesitate to contact Rich or me, and we would be happy to work with you. So our last question has to do with including survivors in the work that you're doing. So I don't know if in terms of the council here in Colorado, or Kirsta, what you're doing in Texas. We have just 3 more minutes, but if each of you want to kind of talk about the value of including survivors in training or in combating these things, that would be great.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I can say real quickly, we have very strong survivor participation in many of our regional coalitions, where they are members of various working groups, where the survivor perspective is being brought by survivors, which is obviously the most accurate way to bring it. I would say in this context, it's very important, I think, to have a variety of, or if you can, more than one survivor who has come from more than one situation, because it's super easy to have your lived experience, but because you have your lived experience, you're not necessarily looking at other people's lived experiences. So I think it's very useful to have more than one survivor speaking in, because then you have more of that breadth of experience. But yeah, I think it's a critical component.
Yeah, I totally agree with that last point, and yes, good question. I would broaden this to talk about sort of constituent or vulnerable populations along with survivors. So in our work, there has been a lot of exploitation of herders, who are these workers out in the mountains herding sheep and cattle. And through one of them who had been trafficked, we heard about a man who was doing outreach, who was a former herder himself. And he has contracted with us for years to do the same type of outreach, just going out and talking to herders, because he knows how to find them. These are really very remote places. Can really earn their trust because he's been in their position, and he's done a lot. He himself, I don't think, was experienced trafficking, but that's one example. Also, we had an outreach partner that was a youth organization, and had their main outreach person was a youth who had experienced trafficking, who again could just relate so well to the youth. It's apart from outreach, I think it's very important to, yes, absolutely, to have the voices in all the dialogue, whether it's my office's planning or whether it's a state council. We all need to be better informed by survivors. So our state council, under the state statute, does have 2 survivors on it. I will acknowledge it. I feel personally as though it took them a while to get a voice, sort of a big group with a lot of senior sort of folks from different state agencies and nonprofits and so forth. And in hindsight, I think we could have done more to help them feel comfortable, with having a stronger voice earlier. But over time, yes, they've become sort of more vocal, more accustomed to sort of how these meetings operate, and have become more vocal. And definitely, it's an important effort to include survivors.
Excellent, thank you. And want to give we'll wrap it up here. Give a special thanks to Kirsta and Pat for joining us today and for your excellent remarks. And thank you everyone for joining, and thank the Office for Victims of Crime for your partnership in this work and in this webinar. So we'll leave that there, and if you do have any questions, do not hesitate to contact us. So thank you so much, everyone.